Here's an idea. The American West, the Wild West, the stuff that to many in the world is movie sets and big hats and six guns and myths and legends of things that never happened and some sort of puffy melodrama that took place a long time ago. That Wild West is rich in lessons of leadership and organization that we can use today. Now, the West is a little tricky to define, sort of the last half of the 19th century, sort of 1850-ish to somewhere in the early 1900s. It flexes. And it's difficult to define the West geographically. Certainly Wyoming and Montana and Arizona and Texas are all the West. But what about Missouri and Oregon and California and Mexico? It's all the West. So let's not draw too sharply the lines in time or place. But let's look instead at some stories that in fact took what was a really raw, rugged frontier, lawlessness, wars between Indian tribes and European settlers moving west, extreme climates, competition for scarce resources, cattle rustling, hangings. That was the Wild West, and yet within 40 years, 45 years, the West had transformed to a place with churches and cities and schools and city councils and roads and politicians and goals. And the West became a part of the larger United States. And the fact that that transition took place speaks to the fact that there had to be some extraordinary examples of leadership and insight and organization. Let's look, if we might, closely, or a little more closely, at three of them. Three secrets of leadership from the Wild West. Why secrets? Well, because people like secrets. The first of our leadership secrets of the Wild West is based on an interesting image. We call it the lines, and this is the handsome fellow who gives rise to our very first leadership lesson. As the Civil War was ending, settlers were moving west, and the eastern part of Kansas used to be open plain, but now it's being settled by a lot of farmers who, many of them are Civil War veterans, pretty tough guys, and their wives, and their kids. This Longhorn was one of thousands upon thousands upon thousands that were driven by the cattle barons from Texas in the late 40s and 50s up the Chisholm Trail to the railheads in Kansas City. The problem is that those cattle started going across those farms that were now being settled in eastern Kansas. And the farmers said, enough. And the cowboys said, we're going through. And the farmers took out guns. Cowboys and farmers shot at each other and shot at cattle. Some fell in place, and the cattle business just about ground to a halt. Now, that couldn't stand in a growing new country. So, introduce this unhappy-looking fellow who gets happier. His name is Joseph McCoy. Joe McCoy was a young businessman, dealt in commodities and so forth in Chicago. And he read in the papers about the range war in Kansas and how the beef industry was being just shut down. He said, something's going to happen here. He took a map and he rolled it out on his desk and he drew a line with his finger from Kansas City, which was the big railhead, out through the area which was contested, out to the west. And he said, okay, I can see what's going to have to happen here. The railroads are going to have to go further west. Where are they going to go? So he started looking at these different places on the map, and he found a place on the map called Mud Gulch. Mud Gulch, 150 miles or so west of Kansas City. He sold most of what he had. He went to Kansas City. He bought a horse, saddled it up, and rode 150 miles to the west of Mud Gulch, just a little creek, a couple of ramshackle sorts of buildings around it. And he bought it. And he changed the name to Abilene. And Abilene McCoy started doing something interesting. He built a saloon, he built stockyards, he built a hotel. And concurrently, he was writing to the railroad barons back in the East that, you know, you really have to bring that rail line out to Abilene because we're going to have all of these cattle coming up here. He's writing to the cattle barons in Texas saying, you'd better get with it and bring your cattle north, not through those contested areas where you're fighting and shooting at each other. Bring them to Abilene. We've got everything all set, and the railroad's coming. Well, it worked. And Joseph McCoy became a very powerful and very successful man. By the early 70s, early 1870s, the Chisholm Trail went up and took hundreds of thousands of head of cattle to Abilene. The rail line, which was established there, carried them back to the east. And McCoy became a very, very wealthy and powerful man. And he had another characteristic that was very popular in the West. When the bankers or the cattlemen were doing business with Joseph McCoy, they knew that they could count on his word. Handshake was really enough. As a matter of fact, the newspapers called him what he later called himself. And we still call somebody who creates a square deal today the real McCoy. So that's what Abilene looked like way back then. This is Joseph McCoy in his later years. And leadership secret number one is figure out where the lines are going, then get out in front of them. Who does that today? Well, Steve Jobs had the good sense to see that technology was an extension of the human senses. And Jeff Bezos saw that you could deliver books to people's houses without a middleman and then everything else in the world. And Elon Musk sees a line that goes all the way out into space and thinks there's a business there. There are people doing it, but you've got to see the line first. Next, principle versus rule. Young Theodore Roosevelt, you recognize him. At 24, he was the youngest state legislator in New York State. He was a brash, hard-driving young man. And when he was 24, and his life, he'd been a sickly young man, you know. His asthma was so bad he had to sleep sitting up in a chair. But he worked through exercise to make himself really pretty rugged. At 24, he had an extraordinary experience. His young wife, whom he loved very much, was in childbirth. He learned while he was on the floor of the state legislature in New York that she was about to die. He took an overnight train and arrived at the house just after she died. And then, that very day, his mother, in the very same house, also died. Roosevelt kept a diary. In that diary, he wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." And he just put an X. Theodore Roosevelt, though. Theodore Roosevelt met his grief head on. He left the legislature, and he went out west, where he thought ruggedness and that sense of adventure might help restore him, because he didn't have anything else to live for, he thought. So he took part of his family inheritance, and he bought a ranch in the Dakotas, and he moved out to the Dakotas and became a rancher for about 3 years. He slept on the ground. He lived with the cowboys. He did everything from riding and roping and fencing that cowboys did. He'd get in bar fights and win. And he was a pretty tough guy at the end of that. He lost most of his family fortune, by the way, when a blizzard wiped out the cattle herd that he'd bought and put together. He really loved being in the West. This is Theodore Roosevelt as the cowboy that he came to be, living a rough, rugged, and vigorous life. This was the Elkhorn Ranch in the Dakotas that he owned and worked. And then 20 years later, after he'd returned to Washington, returned to politics, he was president of the United States. But he believed that this rugged nation needed rugged young people who had been tested in the cauldron of physical challenge. That's what he believed, that's what he lived, and that's what he stood for. But the rugged life that he so supported was under assault. And it was under assault in the game of football. Now, football had been around for a number of decades, and it wasn't quite the game that we think of now, however controversial it may be now. Then, football was played by young men who were very large, would throw themselves together in flying wedges, no pads, gouging, kicking, spitting, all sorts of... As a matter of fact, 45 deaths occurred between 1900 and 1905. 18 in 1905 deaths playing the game of football. And there was an outrage. There was an outcry to ban the game of football. The president of Harvard, preachers, editorialists in the big newspapers, even the old Confederate general, John Mosby, said this carnage of America's youth has to stop. But here's Roosevelt saying, wait a minute. It may be a rough game, but we need it because this is the kind of test that young people have to put themselves through. We need this kind of masculinity. So now the president did something only the president can do. Knowing that he valued this life that he'd learned in the West so highly, he got on the phone, and they had a few phones, and he called the coach of Harvard, the coach of Yale, coach of Princeton, several athletic directors from around the country, called them down to the White House and sat them down. By the way, that meeting became the basis of the organization that later became the NCAA. Roosevelt sits them down and says, gentlemen, we have to change. Something has to change or the game of football is going to be outlawed. And they decided to outlaw the flying wedge. That's where the players would lock arms and bash into each other. So they outlawed the flying wedge. They created a 10-yard rather than a 5-yard down zone. They made a few other changes in the rules, but the big one, and Roosevelt was totally in favor of this, the big rule change was to enfranchise, to support, to legalize something that to that point had been not only an illegal thing to do in football, it had been considered kind of a cowardly thing to do. You know what that was that they then legalized? Roosevelt pushed for it? It was the forward pass. It was the forward pass. So why would they do that? By legalizing the forward pass, they changed the game of football, opened the whole thing up, so you didn't have masses of people slamming into each other. There were still injuries, but the deaths and the serious injuries started going down very, very rapidly. And the game of football would have been extinguished in the early 1900s had it not been for Theodore Roosevelt, absolutely committed to the notions he'd learned in the West. The vigorous life is one everyone must have a chance to lead. Yes, Teddy was a pretty tough guy, and he gives us leadership secret number 2 from the Wild West. When you're faced with a choice between a principle and a rule, change the rule. How does that apply today? Look at the debate over immigration in this country. What is the fundamental value of bringing new and energetic citizens to this country? That's a principle that has always been treasured here. The rules, who comes when and how and under what circumstances, the rules can be moved around, but don't confuse the rules with the principles. The tent. This gentleman is familiar to all of us. Here at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, he's our guiding light, and he is for people throughout the West and in many parts of the world. 110 years or so ago, this fellow right here was the most or among the most famous people in the world. He was a scout, and he was an Indian fighter, and he was an author, and he played himself on Broadway as an actor, and he started the Wild West extravaganzas and toured them around the world, and he wrote a number of books. He was an extraordinary human being for everything that he'd really done. But as remarkable as anything about Cody is that he used his fame and his celebrity to forward the principles of this rising nation that he felt he helped represent. Buffalo Bill walked the walk and talked the talk of values, and his values were somewhat controversial in their day. Yes, he brought together people from all over the world, different races, different colors, women, men. He loved the children, and the children loved him. He was the epitome of the vigorous American male, and that's what he wanted to project. Now, it's not a secret that Buffalo Bill liked the ladies. It's said that all women love Buffalo Bill, and he did his best to reciprocate. But it was more than that. William F. Cody stood strong on behalf of women's rights. He stood strong on behalf of equal pay. He wrote in the Baltimore Sun in the 1890s, he said, every year, more and more fields are being opened to the women, and it does my heart good. He said, I think that if a woman does the same work as a man, she could get exactly the same pay, And I pay the women on my show, and he had a lot of them, they were the stars, several of the stars were female. I pay the women on my show just as I pay the men because I want to do the square thing. You probably know as well that Cody was an advocate for Native American rights. In 1879, only 3 years after Little Bighorn, only 3 years, Cody was petitioning the federal government in Washington to respect Indian rights. This was after he had actually killed a minor Sioux chief and scalped him, saying, "First scalp for Custer." But nevertheless, he stood foursquare on the rights of Native Americans and continued to do so. Sitting Bull did tour with Cody and trusted him as much as any white man there was. It's also interesting to note that Buffalo Bill wasn't troubled by the personal choices or lifestyles of his friends. He had a very long-term and public friendship with Oscar Wilde, the homosexual English poet and writer. The lesbian painter, Rosa Bonheur, was a close friend of his. They visited often. She did the great painting of him that's in the Whitney Gallery upstairs. So Buffalo Bill offers to us a leadership secret that we could sure use today, it seems to me, in these fractious times. Buffalo Bill was a success because he built a big tent and he invited everybody in. Once you got him in the tent, there's a lot you can do. But you got to get him into the tent and invite them all. Now, so that it doesn't sound like I'm just focusing on the white males who taught us things from the Wild West. Let's not forget Phoebe Ann Mosby, for instance, whose leadership secret was that she took an extraordinary skill and honed it to an unknown level, previously unknown level. And as Annie Oakley, her sharpshooting was the toast of the world. She was the best there was, and she clung to it, and she knew it, and she made herself as good with her tools as anybody ever could. And being good with one's tools is one of the true leadership lessons of the West. Or Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. Chief Joseph, when he led his people on that 1,100-mile fighting retreat from 2 army groups trying to get to freedom in Canada, Chief Joseph exited Yellowstone, just north of here, on their way north. And they were stopped in a battle 40 miles short of the Canadian border in Montana. Chief Joseph surrendered. And in his surrender, with great dignity, he said, "From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." Utter defeat, total vanquishment. But the words were picked up. The words were picked up by newspapermen in the East, editorialists, college professors. Suddenly, school children were reciting the words of this chief who had been defeated out west. And the notion of Native American dignity and the need to better respect that dignity helped come from Chief Joseph and his words into the consciousness of America. Choose your words carefully because they may live long after the event that inspired them. That's a leadership secret we could all take home. So, what do we have? Leadership secrets from the Wild West. If we're willing to look past all the movie characters, if we're willing to look past all the myth and all the legend and look at some of the real, valuable, lasting principles of getting us from one place to another, we have to figure out where the lines are going and get out in front of them. We change the rule, but the principles we understand and we cling to. And then, as a guy who lives part of the time in Washington, I gotta tell you, nothing's more appealing than this idea. Build a big tent and invite everybody in. So that the next time somebody says to you, the West, Wyoming, oh, come on, that's just all puffery. And it's a long time ago. Put a frame around it and hang it on the wall. You can say to them, not at all. In fact, I intend to live some of the Wild West today. Thank you.